Well, this video is dedicated to Dennis Rodman, who played for the Southeastern Oklahoma Savages before going to the NBA. I've traveled the world about 4 times, and there are certain things that you don't understand until you've managed to travel the world that many times. The first time you travel, it's a shock to your system because you're absorbing so many different things. And that's not just even plugging in your electric razor or plugging in your phone. It's so many different things that just make you realize that post-World War II, each country split up into different regions and then consequently created their own standards in order to help facilitate transactions within their own economic zone. The second time you travel, you're sort of able to enjoy a little bit more because you finally understand what you're looking at. It takes about 2 times around the world before you really understand what you're looking at and what you're seeing. Because until then, you're sort of in a position where you may appreciate and enjoy, but not understand exactly what it is that you're looking at. And that's because you don't necessarily understand history. And the third time you travel around the world, at that point, you're able to create a historical foundation for yourself so that you can understand through your own Rosetta Stone what's really going on. Now, the fourth time you travel the world, at that point, you're finally in a position where you can create your own narrative independent of whatever it is that you've been taught. And education, of course, is just another word for, the majority or the people in power or whoever has the money to pay the teachers in your area. Education is just another word for creating a narrative that supports their existence and their jobs. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that as long as, the education is honest. And what we're finding out in America is that none of the education outside of math and science has been in any way honest. It's neglected quite a few people historically and quite a few events. And so as a result, for example, we know about Kent State and in the Vietnam protests, but not necessarily Jackson State in Mississippi. We know, even mainstream journalism, the ones that have the money to report, are not very helpful. I was looking at, speaking of Jackson, Mississippi, I was looking at the archives in the state library or the state research center, and there was an interview in 1977 where a World War II veteran essentially disclosed who the informant was that helped bring down Richard Nixon. And this was something that was revealed in my lifetime, in the 21st century, really, right? That this was, the identity of this informant had been confidential for about 30 years. And in fact, it was sitting there in a Mississippi research center when Vanity Fair, quote unquote, broke the story. So you see that there's one of the problems with education, formal education, is that it gives you a narrative that is lazy. And not just lazy in the sense that it supports the status quo, but just lazy in the sense that there's a lot of information out there. And once you create the first draft of a textbook, if you see information that's contradicted something that you've already placed, it costs money to change it. It's at least in the past. It wasn't digital in the past. And, it's a hassle to go in and pay to get, another draft reviewed and authorized. And perhaps also authorized by the school board that may not necessarily like the updated version and may go with another vendor. So you look at all these things together, and I'll just give you one of my lessons. And when I was traveling in Mexico and Central America and South America, the first time around the world, I was sort of awed by how the Zocalo, the city center, was always, a church, a massive church. And it was always the most valuable real estate in that area. And in almost every case, it was surrounded by rundown shops and, very real estate that wasn't really valuable unless it was connected to the state. So there might be a museum, for example, in Mexico City nearby the Zocalo. That area would be worth money because the state invested money in that area. But if you just, try to take a walk around the block, you've got a lot of small businesses that don't actually have any equity in that area. But when you first go there, and you see the huge flag of Mexico flying in the square, you're awed. You're like, this is amazing. These Catholics were really onto something. What you don't see, and this is what the fourth time around the world helps you see. The fourth time around the world helps you see the things that are not there. And the things that are not there, of course, in almost every country that's Catholic, like Italy, for example, are competing religions. So if you go to Indonesia, Jakarta, you'll see a mosque, the big one, and then right across the street there will be a church, a big one as well. And I think both had European designers or architects. But in Mexico and in most of South America, what you see is actually intolerance, because there are no synagogues, there are no Buddhist temples, there are no pagodas, there are no mosques. It's just the Zocalo with the Catholic Church in the middle. And then you start looking at what you don't see, and what you don't see is evidence of essentially a takeover of the state by a powerful entity. And in fact, that's Mexican history. The Catholic Church became so powerful that the state confiscated the property of the Catholic Church. And so everywhere in the world, the Catholic Church is always concerned about having its property taken away from them. It happened in Germany as well. In Germany, the Holy See made a deal with Hitler in order to preserve its property in exchange for, I'm not sure, non-interference, non-confiscation. And so it was called Concordat, I think. But I don't speak German, so I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. With respect to, you look at in Mexican history, the Mexican economy actually got better when a general, I believe his name is Porfirio Diaz, I believe, I'm not sure about this, okay? He came into power and he returned the property that was confiscated from the Catholic Church back to the Catholic Church. And so from that point, you saw a little bit more stability. You saw a history that was probably more stable than in France, where Napoleon came in and also confiscated the Catholic Church's property and forced the administrative body of the Catholic Church to answer to him. And, and he was so successful because he was fighting on behalf of the people as opposed to the status quo, I suppose. And so one of the reasons Napoleon was so successful was because he was, in a sense, a populist. He was a populist. He wanted to create a system that was of laws that were, easy to understand as opposed to complex, and therefore, non-workable or non-understandable by the general population, and so on and so forth. So in fact, the more complex you make the laws, the more you can charge for tuition to teach the laws, and that creates its own separate body of elites. That, of course, is one reason why there are so many revolutions all over the world, whether in China or somewhere else where the elites who are supposed to use the laws to protect the people fail and simply use them to create a body of ever more complex laws that eventually backfires, because the more complex the system, at some point it's just too expensive to protect the individual. And of course, that's not even considering just private school tuition or even public school tuition at this point. And so suddenly that Zocalo, you can understand European history, you can understand American history, you can understand so many different things. You can understand, why is the American Supreme Court majority Catholic when none of the founders of the United States were Catholic, when the Catholic Church was banned in New York City, in the colonies at that time. You put all these things together and what you're looking at is history. And that's why you're supposed to travel. And what you have to really see when you travel is something James Baldwin eloquently expressed. He said that, when I was growing up, we used to play, cowboys and Indians. And I always wanted to be the cowboy. And it wasn't until I grew up, that I became older, that I realized that I was actually the Indian. In the historical perspective, I was the Indian, but I was somehow playing the cowboy. And it took me a long time to figure out that I should have been on the side of the Indian, and I should have been on the side that wanted the cowboys to lose. And this is why travel is revolutionary. It changes everything, but it only changes everything if you are dedicated to it, just like anything else, whether it's a sport, whether it's a book, or anything else. And so what I want to suggest is that travel by itself, especially if it's only 1 or 2 times, especially if you're not able to sit down and read a book about wherever it is that you're traveling to, it's not that travel will be meaningless. It will, on some level, shock your system into a higher understanding. But if you really want to get to a higher level of understanding, especially with respect to history, you're going to have to keep going. And you're going to have to try to understand not just the narrative that's been taught to you, but just the narrative that's been taught all over the world, and also why that narrative is wrong. And when you can do that, then you can call yourself an educated person.